You're listening to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcast on international trade agreements.
In an increasingly global and connected world, securing market access for EU products, services and investments with other major economies is crucial. That's why the European Union is busy negotiating ambitious trade agreements with countries like the US and has just signed a deal with Canada.
But how does the EU do this? And what are the mechanics of international trade deals and the main challenges to their successful conclusion? Let's get to the heart of the matter. Stay with us.
Thanks to the developments in transport and communications, it is now easier to produce, buy and sell goods and services and invest around the world. This gives European companies the possibility to trade outside Europe and allows foreign companies to sell their goods and services in the EU.
So every day, Europe exports hundreds of millions of euros worth of goods and imports hundreds of millions more. The EU is currently the world's second largest exporter and importer of goods and services, representing around 15% of global trade.
Which is quite a big slice, especially if we consider that the US and China account for 12% and 10% of global trade respectively. So why does the EU have such a strong trade position?
Well, there are many reasons, starting with the fact that we have 500 million consumers looking for quality goods. But we're also the world's largest single market, with a single set of rules and tariffs for imports and exports.
That single market means the EU has also achieved a strong position, since it acts together with one voice on the global stage, rather than 28 separate trade strategies. The question is, how has the EU used its single voice in trade matters?
Well, it's actually a long story. The EU has been negotiating trade agreements since the 1960s, first with African, Caribbean and Pacific countries, the so-called ACP group, with other non-community European countries, and with Mediterranean partners, and progressively with partners on every continent.
The content of these agreements has also evolved, from mainly goods to include also services, investment, public procurement, intellectual property rights, sustainable development principles, and regulatory cooperation.
So in the light of these developments, the EU is busy modernising some of the old agreements, negotiating new bilateral agreements with Asian, Oceanic and North American partners, and advancing the multilateral trading system through the Trade and Services Agreement, or TISA, and the Environmental Goods Agreement.
But all this trade activity has raised questions about who is entitled to negotiate, on behalf of whom, and with what aims. The public demonstrations against TTIP, the Walloon Regional Parliament's resistance to CETA, and Dutch voters' opposition to the association agreement with Ukraine point clearly to increasing discomfort over the way in which international trade deals are negotiated.
They also call into question some procedural issues. For instance, what happens if one member state does not ratify a trade agreement? Let's dig into this.
International trade was one of the first sectors in which EU member states agreed to pool their sovereignty. As a result, trade policy is an exclusive power of the EU, meaning it is the EU who negotiates and concludes bilateral and multilateral trade agreements on behalf of all its member states.
And since the Lisbon Treaty, no trade deal can be approved without the green light of the European Parliament. But let's go to the beginning of the process.
Well, before negotiations can start, the Commission holds public consultations and informal dialogues with a potential trade partner to test the ground and see what the broad lines of the negotiation could be.
If the result of this scoping exercise is positive, the Commission requests the Council's authorisation to start negotiations. At the same time, independent organisations such as think tanks or universities are asked to assess the potential economic, social and environmental impacts that the new trade agreement could have.
With the Council's negotiating mandate, which sets out the general objectives to be achieved, the Commission can begin talks. During these talks, it continues to consult with the Council and must also keep the European Parliament informed.
Since the Lisbon Treaty, Council and Parliament are actually on equal footing on trade matters, as no deal can pass without the Parliament's consent. So to avoid any last-minute surprises, the Commission and Parliament meet at the beginning of and during the negotiations to identify sticking points and see whether there is enough political support to carry on.
Once the final text is there, the Commission informs the Council and Parliament and the legal scrubbing can start to ensure that the text is legally coherent and translated into all EU languages before moving into the final signature and conclusion of the treaty.
But to enter into force, the new trade deal must be signed and ratified, which means that the EU needs to define first who has the legal competence to do so. And this, as the agreement with Canada has shown, can have very serious consequences. So let's take a look at the different options here.
The key to the issue is who has the competence on the matters being negotiated. Are we talking about exclusive competences of the EU, about shared competences with the member states, or about concurrent competences?
If the agreement deals only with matters falling under exclusive EU competence, for example, the common commercial policy provisions, then the green light of the European Parliament and the Council is enough to get it ratified. However, when competence is shared with member states, for example, in treaties containing political dialogue clauses, such as association agreements, then we're talking about a mixed agreement, which must be ratified by all EU member states according to their different ratification procedures.
And here's where things can get complicated and lengthy. In some federal states, in particular Belgium, the regional parliaments also need to give the consent if the agreement concerns competences of those regional parliaments.
The problem is that with the evolution of the EU's common commercial policy, there is often confusion as to which subjects are part of the common commercial policy and of exclusive EU competence, and which still require member states' input.
Take investment, for instance. On the one hand, some member states consider that common commercial policy covers only foreign direct investments, such as buying or establishing a business, and not portfolio investments, which means investing in financial assets, such as stocks or bonds in a foreign country.
However, the Commission doesn't see it this way, and it has asked the Court of Justice to clarify matters and decide on the nature of this competence to be able to conclude the EU-Singapore Agreement. But the implications of the ruling will certainly go further.
Another example of a shifting legal basis is CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with Canada. After first considering that it fell under exclusive EU competence, the Commission had to change its position and submit it as a mixed agreement,
opening the door to ratification by all national and even some regional parliaments. A legal requirement which was used by the Walloon government in Belgium to delay the signing of the deal in order to clarify some of their doubts on the treaty.
So when does a new trade agreement come into force?
Well, a new trade agreement enters into force once it is fully ratified by all competent parties, but parts of the agreement can be provisionally applied if the member states agree to do so, and in practice after the European Parliament has been consulted on the matter.
For example, the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement has been partly provisionally applied since 2014, while the commercial part of the agreement has only provisionally applied since January 2016.
Being a mixed agreement, provisional application normally applies only to EU competences. For its full entry into force, all member states must have ratified it, but the Dutch voters' no in the advisory referendum is delaying this moment and forcing the EU into some late-night negotiations to find a solution.
And the stakes are high, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of jobs and opportunities for growth and development on both sides, not to mention the EU's credibility to be able to continue speaking with one voice on the global trade arena.
You're listening to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcasts.